Hi, everybody. My name is Margot Sanger-Katz. I'm a reporter at the New York Times, and I am so excited to have my two colleagues here to talk about their incredible investigative book, The Fall of Roe. Sorry, I'm getting the title wrong. Not a good start. I just want to first of all plug their book. It's amazing, and it is available for sale here at Pepgate all day, and then they're going to be doing a signing over in the Marble Garden tent at 5 o'clock this afternoon. So listen to them talk and then buy their book and get it signed by them. This book is kind of an autopsy of Roe versus Wade and tells us all of these really insightful things about how this big change in American law and life came to be. It's stuffed with all these incredible moments, personal moments of the people who made this happen, the people who were upset that it happened, and also the people whose lives this change affected. You guys have their bios in your programs, so I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but Lisa, who's immediately to my left, is a political correspondent at the New York Times where she has covered 5 presidential elections. And then to my far left is Elizabeth Dias, who writes about religion and all the ways that it intersects with our politics and culture and has been doing that for a very long time. From all kinds of interesting perspectives as well. And I'm sure you can imagine why their collaboration led to this kind of book. So here's the run of the show. I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. Then I'm going to leave time for you guys to ask questions. So please get ready for that. There will be microphones. I will remind you then, but let's try to keep the questions to questions, and then let's come tell our stories after the panel is over so we have time for everyone. I just wanted to start by asking you guys about the genesis of this project. There have been a lot of abortion books in the last 2 years, and yours strikes me as like the only one that I've read that's like really a political book and is really about how we got here. I have to say, like, my own reporting on abortion has been very focused on the consequences, like what happened because this change happened. And I'm wondering, like, why you thought this was the right target.
Well, I think really the genesis, so Elizabeth and I both joined the Times around the same time in 2018. We'd worked a lot of other places before that, and we quickly became friends, and we had been watching, like alongside you, like you had been, the increasingly restrictive laws in the states, and we wrote about them. Sometimes we wrote about them together. And so it was a line of coverage for us that we had been doing before the Times and then continued at the Times. And then we were both listening to oral arguments in the Dobbs case, which of course is the case that ended up ending Roe. And I remember the moment, as does Elizabeth. There was a moment in oral arguments, which was in December 21, where Justice Barrett started talking about safe haven boxes. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. Which are, for those of you who don't know, they're these little boxes that are at fire stations or community centers where if someone has a baby and they don't want it, they can leave the newborn in the box, and it'll be adopted, right? And her argument was effectively, well, why do you need abortion rights when you have these boxes? And if someone gets pregnant, they can put the baby in the box, and it's no problem. And I was on the phone with Elizabeth,
and we said, Roe is going to end.
Right. It's
Roe is over.
Yeah, this is over. And this feels like a huge moment, not only, of course, for reproductive rights and access to healthcare and all the things like that, and of course for women in America, but also in our country's political story. Like this is, and in our country's cultural story, which is really the zone at which we sit between politics and culture. And we said, well, someone must be writing this story because this seems like a pretty big moment. And then nobody was, and we were. And we decided to structure our book on obviously this is a 50-year story. Roe was decided in 73. But we really wanted to hone in on this last 10 years, and what we've called the final decade of the Roe era, because it turned out, although we didn't know at the time, Roe was an era like other eras in American life. It had a beginning and an end. And because we felt like that 10-year period, that decade, was not only the best way to show how we got to the fall of Roe. This wasn't something that just happened, although it may have felt like that to a lot of people. It was also a way to look at this issue and tell this larger story about our democracy, about our country, and really about the state of women in this big American project. So that sort of was the genesis. I don't know what did I forget?
Well, no, just as we started reporting and getting into it, I mean, we'd each covered the movements on the right and the left for so long. but we were sort of stunned at all of everything we were learning along the way, all of this new reporting about how the anti-abortion movement was so successful under the radar for many people who just thought Roe was a fact of American life and could never imagine that it would go away. And as part of that, yes, abortion is about the procedure itself, right? And that's that specific thing. But our reporting and listening to the stories of the people who worked to end Roe and the people who did not want that to happen, we really saw this narrative emerge about abortion as a symbol for so much else in America, right? It became, we started to see it as this is a nexus of everything from religion to equity to healthcare to
women.
Yeah, women. And when people are talking about abortion, what they're really talking about is something that's so much bigger. And so we wanted to explore what the stakes of that are. And we really came to believe if you understand the story of how Roe fell, you will have tools to understand where this country is going on so many other issues.
One thing that really struck me about this book is that you have these incredibly intimate portraits of the activists on the right who helped bring about the end of Roe. And it's so closely observed. You hear their thoughts, you hear about their political and in some cases religious awakenings. And I think a lot of people who write about abortion from the left and don't have a lot of empathy for those characters, and we don't hear their voices so much in the kind of mainstream portrayals of the story. So I have two questions for you guys. One is just why did you think that was important to include those voices? But two, I just know in my own experience as a reporter, sometimes it's really hard to get those kinds of activists to trust you as a reporter coming from the New York Times, kind of coming from the mainstream media, and there's a lot of perception of bias. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you got those people to trust you enough to tell you about these really intimate moments in their lives.
So I think, so there's two things with that. First of all, they won, right? Let's be frank about what happened here. They were the winners. Roe is no longer in existence. This was a 50-year goal for them. And we thought it was important to tell the story of how they won. And I understand why so much of the coverage has been focused on what is lost. And I don't disagree that that's the right place to put that coverage. But I do think there's both a historical and a narrative and a political imperative to tell the story of how this all went down. We also felt that this was such a big issue. I've covered politics a long time. That's what I do, right? You heard all those presidential campaigns. I can't believe I covered, but I did. Somehow survived. And, abortion was often seen as this issue that was like this thing. It was for female voters. It's how you rally the base, right? It wasn't taken seriously as a major political narrative story and a major political issue. And in fact, it was. And that's what we've learned. We can talk about this later, but that's what we've learned since Roe's fallen. It is a major political issue. And we felt it deserved the same kind of independent journalistic treatment that we all specialize in at the Times, and that these other big issues get, foreign policy or the economy. And so we wanted to attempt to do that and see what we could find out and what such an investigation could uncover. In terms of the sourcing, I'll throw that to you.
Sure. I appreciate the question, and it was really hard. We interviewed more than 350 people for this book, and we did the whole project in 2 years, which looking back seems sort of insane. But the relationships, the sources that we had built for our entire careers before then was what made it possible. I've covered the conservative Christian movement in the US almost my whole career, and been listening to people who always felt that they were not being heard. And so in being able to document that story over so much time, they trusted us. And
also you have a seminary degree, which probably
helps. True. I did go to Princeton Theological Seminary, so I can talk religion. It's like sometimes there's it's like speaking different languages, and I could talk with them in ways that we could both understand. And I also just, I think it's brave always of a source to speak publicly. They were, of course, many of them were incentivized. They really wanted to. It's different now, and there's been so much backlash, but they really wanted to show like this how they won, because this really is one of the biggest political resurgences, for better or for worse, that America has ever seen. And they were a tiny minority who were able to do that and wanted that mainstream recognition for their work. But it wasn't just big political players. I spent time in an anti-abortion pregnancy center the day Roe fell, almost 2 years ago on Monday. I was actually inside a center like that outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, when the decision came down. And I think it took a bit of bravery for those women who ran that to let us in.
You also, of course, have stories from the left, and a big theme seems to be denial. Obviously, a lot had to go right for the anti-abortion movement to prevail in this. I mean, I don't want to. You guys write about how much planning there was, but there was also, some luck in terms of how things went with the Supreme Court and, which case got where when. But you also portray a Democratic Party and a set of abortion rights activists who were caught flat-footed at key moments. Why do you think they didn't see this coming? I was thinking of that moment you were describing during the oral arguments, and I had the same exact realization that you had. I was like, oh, wow, like this is going to go down. And I felt like even then, it was really hard to get anyone to take seriously the prospect,
When we took the book to publishers after that moment, the main question we got was, okay, but like, what if Roe doesn't fall? And we're like, no, guys.
You were like, it's over.
There are many concerns with this project. That is not one of the concerns, but there was this pervasive sense of denial. Now, clearly, there were many people who saw this coming inside the abortion rights movement. They had been watching these restrictive laws for a long time. But I think in the broader Democratic Party, and also, the majority of people in America who had supported some form of federal abortion rights for decades and still support some form of federal abortion rights. In fact, as we've both reported in slightly higher numbers, they didn't see this coming at all. And I think in some ways that's kind of natural, right? There's a few things going on. First of all, if something has been built into American life for 2 generations, it's hard to imagine it could just disappear. That doesn't feel like something that happens in the United States, right? I think we have an understanding of how political change happens, which is basically you build support, you enter the cultural consciousness, you build cultural support. Like I'm thinking of same-sex marriage, right? You have will and grace, it starts becoming accepted, and then the laws start to change, and the politicians follow the voters. This is a story where the opposite happened. There was majority support for some kind of federal abortion rights. There is still majority support for some kind of federal abortion rights, but the anti-abortion movement was able to get in and control and work the levers of power in American democracy to their advantage, and do this without changing hearts and minds. So I think it's hard to see that for people, and I don't blame them for that. I also think the politics of it, everything has changed so much that it's worth reminding ourselves of what the politics were in the Roe era, which was, and we got tons of data on this from polling and focus groups and internals and numbers and all kinds of stuff, which was abortion was much more motivating for the right than for the left, even the base, so the Republican base versus the Democratic base. And that also makes sense. Nobody is like, I'm really energized and gonna get out there for the status quo, right? That's not like a great rallying call for change. But the anti-abortion movement was trying to change something. So what that meant is Democratic candidates, they would mention it in passing, as we've all heard. They would use it at certain moments to fundraise or rally their base, but it wasn't an issue that really worked for them in a major way in campaigns. So, they didn't really push it in the way that we saw them push other issues, and that also, I think, contributed to the sense that this was an issue that was like some fight of your mother or your grandmother, and it was sort of established. And look at Juno, and this Grey's Anatomy had an abortion plot line, and this is sort of, the country has moved on. And in fact, that was the case, but not for this small minority of anti-abortion activists.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned, Elizabeth, this scene in a crisis pregnancy center, and throughout the book, you guys do have these portraits of women who are pregnant, kind of in the month in which Roe fell, which is almost exactly 2 years ago.
Monday, 2 years Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why did you guys feel like you wanted to include those stories, and what's the work that you think that they do?
It was really important to us to include these voices because this is a story, yes, it's political, right? That's how it's perceived so often in the public space, but it's unbelievably personal. And everyone, if you have been pregnant, wanted to be pregnant, didn't want to be pregnant, were born, we're a baby at some point. Like this is so good. This affects your life, your family, people you love and care about. And there's something about it that is so intimate, right? In a way that doesn't happen for other political issues. And the way in which the personal and the political had been divorced so often in this, in the broader public conversation was something we felt really needed to be changed. And so the way we structured the book, the main narrative really goes through like the inside story of how Roe fell and what the activists and the lawyers and the politicians were doing and all that inside behind the scenes stuff. But we kind of encapsulated it in these snapshots from different places across America, the final month of Roe, June of 2022. And it's very intimate. It's right up close. So it starts in this anti-abortion Catholic pregnancy center in Ohio. And then we document what ends up being the last abortion in the state of South Dakota. And then we're inside the clinic in Jackson, Mississippi, which was the one at the center of the Dobbs case. And one of the things we found so interesting and like where I think still reflecting about this is the struggles of all of the women who came to all of those places, even though they have the centers themselves are doing like radically opposite things. Like one is working to prevent people from having abortions, one is providing them, like one is trying to figure out how to do that as it's getting shut down. But the story, like it actually was like, you had to remember which center am I in because I'm listening to these stories from these women. They're all the same. There's so much mental health crisis, so much lack of support, housing instability, job instability,
childcare,
healthcare. Like the women in the anti-abortion pregnancy center, they were coming not because they were like, should I or should I not give birth? They're coming because they needed some place they could get a pregnancy test so that they could apply for WIC, right? They needed an official...
And WIC is nutrition assistance for pregnant women.
Yes, for women and children. And or they needed, like they didn't have a doctor and they didn't know where to go, so they were Googling and they come here and they can't afford to go to they think they can't afford to go to a doctor. So they're like, I could get a free ultrasound here, even though they don't know that it's not medical grade, right? Those kinds of issues that women were facing were just the need of it was so different from the supply of kind of what was being offered most of the time.
So it's an election year, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask some questions outside the book about how all of this is playing out now and what the future holds. It feels to me like the politics of abortion have almost flipped on their head, that description that you offered, where it was really motivating for Republicans and also where it was kind of not the biggest issue for most voters. It feels like now this is just an incredibly motivating issue for Democrats. We're seeing them, turn out big majorities for ballot initiatives and candidates in some of these off-year elections. We're seeing, television ads, kind of across the country that are focused on abortion. And it also feels like, probably this is going to decide a lot of people's votes potentially in this election. So I don't know, just can you guys give us a sense of how you think this is going to play out and how long you think this is going to continue to be at the center of our political life?
So we don't know, but I think part of what happened here is before Roe fell, this was all theoretical, right? Both sides, especially the anti-abortion movement, but abortion rights supporters too, could pass some legislation. They could pass some bill through the state house that said, abortion's banned at this point with this exception, it's banned at X point with that exception, and it was never interrogated because it was all sort of pretend, right? Because there was Roe and these things never actually, they were stopped in the courts. And then Roe fell, and then all of a sudden the country was plunged into this conversation that we had never had before, where I remember really vividly in July 22 watching the Indiana State House debate whether a raped child could get an abortion. Should that be a carve-out in their law? Because they had conflicting statutes and nobody really knew what the law was. And so you have this like political culture war issue that had been part of our politics for so long and was utterly and completely divorced from the lived medical, emotional, like economic reality of women's lives. And so part of what we see now is the country having this like massive debate over those actual things. I also so abortion, it's deeply, so that's sort of the baseline that I'm looking at it with. It's deeply motivating for a coalition of Democratic voters, Democrats, independents, and some moderate Republicans. Polling on this issue is notoriously terrible, so I don't think it shows up in polls. Like if you ask people, what's your top issue? They're gonna say, as they have for every election and time eternal, the economy. And then sometimes they say immigration. It depends on the poll. It's rare. Abortion is not one or two. But it's become a litmus test issue for these voters. And it's something really, as Elizabeth was saying, it's really intimate. And the political issues, in my experience, that get the most traction are the things that people understand innately. And this is something that people do understand innately. So Democrats see it as one of their strongest issues. I think if President Biden could talk about abortion every day, and he certainly tries, or his campaign, I should say, he would. And they see this as something that's been very helpful for them, that's helped them overperform in every election since Dobbs. And they hope it will help reelect Biden again. We have to see. Trump, of course, is trying to move all over it. He was the biggest champion of the anti-abortion movement in some ways, even though he has a really messy record on this. And now he's trying to be a little messy again and obscure what Republicans would want to do. And Republicans themselves are moving. Like, that's a party in great flux on this issue. What we know for sure is for the anti-abortion movement, the fall of Roe was not the end, it was the beginning of the end. And that's part of why you see these efforts to, limit access to IVF or to limit access to certain types of contraception. But unlike in the Roe era, now they're dealing with a Republican Party that knows how politically toxic these things are. So the dynamic has really changed, and we'll have to see how I think this is something we're gonna be watching for many, many years to come.
Yeah, I think there's this really interesting arc in the book where you see some of these key anti-abortion activists. At the beginning, they're kind of out in the woods and no one in the Republican Party takes them seriously. And then they have this huge victory. I mean, really important victory for people in that movement. And then by the end of the book, you see them kind of cast out again, and a lot of Republicans will not really wanting to deal with them and the political toxicity of this issue. I don't know.
But what we know from the book, that I'll just add to that, is like what we saw in the book is we saw how the fringe, when they started, when the beginning of our book in 2013, many in the anti-abortion movement didn't believe Roe could fall. And so what you see in this 10-year arc is how the fringe of that movement became the mainstream. So even though they're not now on the outs, right? Like, look, there are very few issues in American life that have like 80% approval, and access to fertility treatments and contraception are two of them. So Republicans know that's toxic for them, but that doesn't mean that that movement can't claw back in, right?
That's been the story of the anti-abortion movement really for 50 years, right? This is one of the things we really learned was the way that movement thinks in generations, not just in political cycles. So if you're planning for success, 20, 40, 50 years out, that enables you, they were doing institution building, there's the thinking on that kind of time horizon enabled them to have a different kind of success than just, what are we going to do for this midterm election? What are we going to do for the presidential?
Which is where the left was.
But how are they thinking about the future? Like, you were telling the story, the way that normally major political change happens is you win the hearts and minds first, then you get the political change. So this is kind of a reversal of that. Are they trying to win the hearts and minds? Do they have optimism that they can get more people on their side?
They say that they can, but I think they are coming to grips really in a way that they didn't 2 years ago, just how much of a minority they are in America. It's only about 8% of American adults want to ban abortion with no exceptions at conception. That's a very minority view. And it was higher 10 years ago, actually. It's been shrinking. But I think if you think in these spiritual terms, like so many of them do, right? They're operating on there's a divine element to this that I think may be hard for a lot of people on the outside to understand. And they fervently are are working to do that. But this main difference is that when that veil of denial is gone, the game is kind of up for everybody. So everyone is paying attention now to what they actually want to accomplish.
But from the real politics perspective, not the far less spiritual perspective, they also have a lot of really important posts of power.
Yes.
Right? Like what we have seen is this conservative Christian movement has gained power. They've gained power in state houses. They've gained power. Look, Mike Johnson came out of that movement, who's now the Speaker of the House. They have certainly gained power at the Supreme Court, as we saw.
We see it in other things, like in Louisiana this week. The state now requires the 10 Commandments to be posted in every public school. So this is extending. This is an ideological system that really, we talk about in the book, is it's far more than abortion. It's really about rolling back the entire sexual revolution.
And we got some internal documents in our reporting that really lay out some of the places that movement wants to go. And so I think it can be easy to discount them and say, well, the denial's gone. They don't have any political, but they still do have this grip on power. And they're really deeply intertwined with like the MAGA movement. It's hard to separate those two things out in a lot of ways. So, and that, as we know, remains a very powerful movement in our politics. We're in an election that's essentially a coin flip right now. So, and largely because of that movement.
Right. You see, by the time January 6th happened, you see, like even we were interviewing people who were part of the attack on the Capitol, and there were ardent anti-abortion activists there, and they'd become election deniers, and the election deniers were supportive of the anti-abortion movement. What we saw over this transformational decade is the way that our politics really radicalized, and we could talk about the role of the internet in that. It certainly was part of that for this movement too, but you can see that acceleration and moving to the fringe, and the power that can have for everybody else.
So the religious right does have a lot of institutions, and I think the Supreme Court is a really important one. It's important in the overturning of Roe, and it also is important in like lots of other things that it wants to achieve. And I think you guys do a really nice job of laying out how strategic over a long period of time these activists are, and how they're connected with legal strategists and people who write legislation and lawmakers at state. And this is a very coordinated, multi-pronged effort. So what else do they want to achieve? Like what do you think are the next big goals for this movement that they could use this playbook to achieve?
Well, what we're seeing already is issues of trans rights in schools, and they talk about it in terms of parental rights for gender-affirming care, and the way schools play into that. So we see a lot of legislation about that in the states, cases coming up about that, but they really want to. It's all of those things that the sexual revolution sort of ushered in are the very things that now this movement wants to, same-sex marriage, that they want to take back, and they want to also increase the place, they say, of religion, but it really manifests most of the time as conservative Christianity. They want to increase the presence of those ideas in American public life, which is how you get things like the 10 Commandments. It's hard to sort of take in the tentacles, because they really actually are everywhere. There's a very sophisticated legislative operation. There's a new group, the National Association of Christian Lawmakers, that is pushing legislation to further restrict abortion, and this stuff like the 10 Commandments laws.
And what about on the left? I mean, what is next? How, as we said, they were a little surprised by this, not quite ready. It's been 2 years. We see abortion very much in our political conversation, but what's actually happening? What are the Democrats and the abortion rights groups? What do they have planned to try to fight back against this big change that they don't like?
Well, so what we see happening, as you've covered as well, is we have all these referendums and ballot initiatives happening in the states. So in some ways, they're going back to the state level. That was, the anti-abortion movement started on this very local level, and so they're sort of returning to that, and those ballot initiatives are efforts to enshrine abortion rights in state constitutions. They've been very successful with them, but that's a limited strategy, right? You're not going to pass a ballot initiative enshrining abortion in Mississippi, or Alabama, or a place like that, or Louisiana. And also what we see in some of those states is states with Republican-led state legislatures, they are doing things to raise the bar, make it harder for those things to pass. And we saw that in Ohio. The referendum passed anyhow, but there was an effort to do that. So that's what's happening at the state level. At the federal level, there's no magic wand. There's nothing anyone can do and just be like, whoa, we just did this thing and Roe is back. That's not a thing. So when Democrats talk about restoring Roe, frankly, there really isn't a plan to do that. There's been some legislation. There's no widespread agreement on what restoring Roe would look like. What would that mean in terms of weeks, in terms of all kinds of things, and that's across the Democratic Party. There's no agreement on that. And there's also a major political problem, which is any bill like that would require 60 votes to pass, which Democrats,
That's because of the filibuster in the Senate.
Because
that's the rule about how the Senate works.
Yes, thank you. So it would be 60 votes, or they have to get rid of the filibuster. And Democrats don't have the votes to do either one of those things, and it is not likely. The filibuster is a little up in the air, but it's pretty unlikely they will have the votes to do those things after the election, even if Biden wins and even if they maintain their hold in the Senate. So it's not clear at all how there's a restoration of federal abortion rights, and I think that's why you see some of these groups really, going back to the state level. There is a lot more funding for those kinds of things now, so there's a lot of money going into those kinds of initiatives, but they're limited.
Do you feel like there's the kind of coordination? Again, I think you guys paint this really great portrait of the anti-abortion forces seem pretty well organized up until Roe falls. And now I think you see some more splintering because they disagree about where to go next. But do you feel like the abortion rights movement is more unified, more organized?
They have more support, right? They have more support from their Democratic allies. Look, you have to remember there was a period towards the start of our book where Democrats actively didn't want to run pro-abortion rights candidates in some conservative areas. They saw that as toxic. And in fact, Democrats first got a voting abortion rights majority in the House in 2018. So when people say, why didn't they codify this during Obama when they had the House and the Senate? In fact, Democrats did not have the votes to codify Roe. So this is all really new. So I think we are starting to see some of that happening. I don't think we're there yet. And we just have to see how this all goes. I think, there was certainly no plan in place when Roe fell that they could just jump into. So this is going to take a long time. And when I talk to people in that movement, I ask, okay, it took 50 years for Roe to fall. How long you think until it takes for something to come back, right? And nobody's telling me 2 years. They're saying, nobody knows, right? But their timeline is 10 years, 20 years. This is going to be this could be a very long process in American life.
So get ready. I'm going to come to you guys soon. I just want to ask you guys a question about writing a book. You guys have been newspaper reporters and magazine reporters for a long time. I have never written a book. I don't know that I would have the attention span for it. This was a huge undertaking. You interviewed hundreds of people. You stitched together all of these stories. Can you just tell us a little bit what it was like and what you learned about how to do this kind of journalism?
We're very tired. We're very, very tired. I had a baby right
1 week.
1 week after we signed the contract on the book. So that was crazy. We're very tired, but the process is really different. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. Well, I would say if you're going to write a book, write it with a really good, not just friend, but person, like a business partner. It actually is a partnership, and we felt like we're running this book. Business is just our book, and I think it was a really valuable reporting partnership because of our shared understanding about the importance of independent journalism and understanding culture as part of political coverage, but also the different sourcing we each brought to the project. I'd spent 15 years covering the right, and Lisa had such incredible sourcing with some Democrats that I certainly didn't have. And it would have been a very different book if only one of us had done it.
We couldn't
have done it.
We couldn't have done it.
This book exists because of the way we wrestled way too many ideas together at way too many phone calls of the day through all hours of the day and night for 2 years.
And I also think it speaks to the treatment this issue deserves, right? Like, you can't just cover it as just a political story or just a religious story. Like, you just can't see the full picture without both of those areas of expertise. So I guess we made it through because we both respect each other.
You seem to still like each other, which is
Yeah,
also
it's
very
true.
impressive.
That part is, I'm actually the most proud of that.
We're so proud of that, yeah.
We're so proud of that because we've seen it go very bad, as I'm sure you have too, with other people.
I think we just like learned a lot from each other too throughout the process, and you have to have a lot of trust and I think humility for partner. Humility in that endeavor.
Process.
All right, audience, here we go. It's your turn. I just want to remind everyone, I know this is an emotional topic and people have stories they want to tell. I feel like let's ask questions now so that we can have a lot of them, and then come talk to us afterwards. We do want to hear your stories too. And just wait for a microphone. And this woman here in the blue flowered dress.
Hi, I'm actually really interested in reading the story, especially as it relates to the other elements. The piece that chills me a bit is the longer range intergenerational plans. And as you talked about our denial, or a lot of people's denial of losing something that we've had rights to, of course I'm thinking democracy.
Yeah.
How much is that part of the plan?
It's a really hard question in some ways. I mean, I think we are living at a time where democracy is being tested like certainly never before in, I think, anyone's lifetime in this room, and I see it every day in my day job. What's interesting about, I think, how the anti-abortion movement did this is they didn't break any laws, right? They didn't have, some of them were like messed up in that siege, right? And they were outside the Capitol. But this wasn't a situation, they worked the system we had. They broke norms. They didn't confirm, McConnell didn't confirm Merrick Garland. There were sort of traditions in the American system and rules, not rules, but norms that, it was sort of expected that everybody, political norms and governmental norms that everyone played by, and they didn't play by those. And as a result, they were able to sort of get this thing through. So I do think one area I think a lot about the issue of democracy is with the Supreme Court, because one thing we think this really shows us is how, the court was already becoming more politicized in people's minds because of those confirmation processes. But then with this decision, you do see this moment, right, this break, and the numbers shift, and people begin to see the court as more of a political body, and you begin to have all these, and look, us, the media, we begin to treat the court as more of a political body. We're looking at ethics, we're investigating flags, we're looking at all these things. And if the court exists, the power of the court in our democracy is because we believe that it is this impartial temple of or this temple of judicial impartiality. And if we, America, no longer believe that, then that's a pretty core democratic tradition that's being eroded in ways that could be quite problematic. Like in my day job, I think a lot about political violence and political unrest with this election, and I worry about it. So I think the things are intertwined.
Yeah, and I would just add, if when you're tracking the anti-abortion movement over time and some of their tactics, whether or not they were accepted by the mainstream of their movement or not, but this was a movement at which violence was at the center with assassinations of doctors for years, and these kind of that's arson, and what was the other thing I wanted to say? Oh, the misinformation piece of it. What we can see very clearly are two radically different views of science and the way science connects with society, and what that so the anti-abortion movement, and we show this, the mainstream science was not credentialing their studies about things like fetal pain, et cetera. So they built institutions with their own scientists to credential their own studies and present their own expert witnesses in court cases, right? So you can see these very separate worlds building, and it would be interesting to kind of discuss that. I would be curious to hear a conversation about that versus vaccines, and these other areas of conflict between especially a conservative Christian worldview and a mainstream science one.
All the way in the front here.
Thank you. I live in Ireland, so this is an outsider
yes.
looking in.
Well, you've had your own story about abortion in Ireland.
Yes, very much so. This is a uniquely American story and also of women in America. So I'd be interested in your reflections on what it told you about kind of women's role in America and American politics, and what might it hold in the future, not just for abortion, but the role of women's issues.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, look, the place of women from Abigail Adams saying famously, you know, remember the ladies to her husband, right? Like there's always been this sort of debate over the place of women in the American experiment. And I think when you read the opinion in Dobbs, you see that really clearly. And one thing we really look at is this idea of like how this anti-abortion movement is reconciling these beliefs with like the rise of women's professional power and the rise of women in the Republican Party. And, you know, they've come up with their own...
And in this movement.
And in this movement, right?
It's a movement
in many
that we
ways,
chose
they're the
led by
face of this movement, right? Which is a political, you know, tactic, but also comes from a place of true belief. So I do think it raises some questions about like whether the place of women in America is really settled, and there is this like this other movement which we sort of call conservative womanhood, like how they think about these ideals and the changes that have swept women's professional lives, and finding ways to reconcile them with this more traditional set of beliefs.
It's a very different vision of what womanhood in America can and should be. I was going to say something else. No.
So I think it's an unsettled story. It shows us that question is still unsettled, you know?
Oh, that was
in
it.
some ways.
When Roe was decided in '73, women in this country couldn't have a credit card in their own name. So, I mean, like, Roe happened first. And when we think about the transformational decade that the Roe era happened and, like, everything that was changing for women, you could start to get your own bank account, you get your own credit card, you could do, you know, Me Too was so far away from, it took another 50 years basically to get to the Me Too movement after Roe. And I think our reporting really showed that, as Lisa was saying, it's just a far less settled question than I think many people want to believe. It's really hard to face the consequences of what that would be. Other thing I would just say to you is Ireland and Europe, the anti-abortion movement has been working. They're starting to try to, you know, build their similar movement like they did here in Europe. So they're extending their law firms and trying to do similar things.
Here in the purple.
Thank you for doing this work. And what does your work tell you about the concept of precedent for the Supreme Court? Is that dead?
Well, precedent can certainly change.
It was not as sacrosanct as maybe people believed, right? I mean, we're not lawyers, either one of us were journalists, but clearly there was this idea that precedent is precedent, right? And maybe it's just like precedent. I don't know. I mean, it depends. I think it does depend on the issue, and like certainly Roe was always, even Ginsburg said that Roe was not on the strongest of legal foundations. It could have been built on a stronger legal foundation, not rooted in the right to privacy, but rooted more in a right, you know, equal rights. So it was open for that kind of reinterpretation. But, you know, if you read Thomas's concurring opinion in that decision, he names some precedents that he would like to look at, and those include same-sex marriage, those include contraception. So, you know,
we have the court, you know, we don't know yet, they haven't decided this case,
Yes.
but it looks like they're going to overturn a major precedent also from the 1970s about administrative law,
Yeah,
that it
Chevron.
changes the way that like every government agency does its business. So I think there are examples even outside of this.
Yeah, for sure. So we're in this is a new era. Like in some ways, this is a court that wants to undo the gains of the, like, you know, the 60s court. You know, they see themselves as this is a different project of this Supreme Court majority.
Making sure I'm not missing anyone in the back. Yeah, I'm here in the front row.
So we're going to have an election, and then it'll be next year. Where have you...
So I hear.
So I hear. Exactly.
Allegedly. Yes.
And I want you to know, you heard it here first. Where have you uncovered voices who are trying to bring people together?
Oh, everyone always asks this question. I mean, this is we're a dark this is a dark panel up here, so I always feel bad when I get this question because I want to have, look, I think the American people are not as necessarily, it's hard to say, right? I think there are a lot of people in America who really do not like the toxicity in our politics and the divisiveness. Many, many, many people, and they're tuning it out, right? But we also know that partisanship has become a proxy for a lot of things. Like there's polls out there that say people would rather have their kid marry someone of a different race and religion than a different political party, right? I mean, both things should probably be open to all those things, I suppose. Let your kid do what your kid wants to do, but in matters of the heart. But there are signs that like our parties are hardening, and we have a political system that reinforces that, right? Of course, the best, easiest way to raise the huge amount of money you need to raise to run for office in America is to go on Fox News or MSNBC and say something that will go viral, and then you get a money bomb of people donating. So I think the American public wants that. We saw in the midterms that the American public rejected some of the voices that were really the most sort of the biggest sort of stop the steal, anti-democratic voices in elections. But I don't know, we live in very divisive eras. I spend time, when I think about this moment, like I talk to historians, and a lot of historians tell me they can't remember a time like this. Like, people who study the Civil War say this feels like the lead up to the Civil War. Different, of course, but there's similarities. So I don't know. I think people want that. It's not like I see some groundswell movement where everyone's coming together. I don't see that. But I don't know.
Well, and there's a question too. I see a little tiny bit of discussion. Like at least there's shared discussion now of like childcare is a problem, right? Like we need to solve issues for women in America, for mothers. Like there's just, the pandemic contributed a lot to that. But there's this question of, okay, you can bring people together, but what is the goal of that if other people are being harmed? And how do you solve that in a societal way? I don't know. Like I'm not sure that you can.
But look, like Biden did get a lot of things done. He has passed a lot of bipartisan legislation, more than
but on these issues,
president in recent memory. So there are things happening, but the toxicity of our politics doesn't seem to be breaking.
Although we do see growing consensus on abortion, right? I mean, across party lines.
Yeah.
On this issue, at least, it may not be working together, but there does seem to be more of a sense that the American public is kind of in one place on this.
Yeah.
Oh, we got more questions. Okay, good. In the back here with the blue sweater.
Hi there. We have another case that we're waiting for the Supreme Court to come down. I wonder if you guys would just kind of like to explain what that is, and maybe if you have any thoughts on it. I mean, with the mifepristone case, obviously we dodged a bullet for that moment, but really just on standing, not on content. So EMTALA, and then of course Comstock. Just curious what you guys are thinking and hearing.
Okay, in your answer to the question, say what those things are.
Yeah. Who wants EMTALA? You want EMTALA? You want EMTALA? I'll do Comstock. So Comstock is a law, a Civil War era law that bans the mailing of lewd material, which included, they'll fact check me if I get any of this wrong, which included, things used in abortion. So there is an idea that if it were to be, there are some plans out there, this Project 2024, which of course is a plan crafted by allies of former President Trump. There's some information in there that if a future administration were to enforce this Comstock Act, they could effectively ban abortion nationwide without having to go through the tiresome business of passing that through Congress by just enforcing this law that's already on the books. So I think there's growing awareness of that law. Trump has not really weighed in on it himself, but we know that people who have been longtime allies of his have said,
his lawyer, his lawyer.
His
lawyer said that
we reported
that he hoped he hoped Trump didn't even know about that, because then he and the lawyer and their allies in the anti-abortion movement could just force it through within a Trump administration.
Should Trump win a second administration? It's impossible to predict how that would shake out, especially because now Trump is definitely more aware of the toxicity of these politics and may have a stronger opinion on not doing something like that because, it would be bad for him politically. But that's sort of the state of play with Comstock.
The other Supreme Court case we're waiting on that you referred to, its shorthand is the EMTALA case or the Idaho case. EMTALA it's the shorthand for an emergency medicine law, federal law, that basically requires hospitals to provide emergency care to a patient. And so the question specifically is, in Idaho, where this came from, which is a state that bans abortion now after Roe, would a hospital be required to provide an abortion and care to a woman coming in an emergent situation? And I don't want to be predictive ever about the court, but I will say, similar to the FDA case, in some ways for the anti-abortion legal movement, the losses can be sometimes as important as the victories because they are learning. Like, it's all a chessboard we talk about in the book. Like, they're literally passing laws in different circuit court states, like similar laws, in order to game it so that they'll eventually get to the Supreme Court to rule on the exact thing that they want to achieve the outcome that they want. So they're learning through all of this, right? And the other case, the FDA case, is just going, it's back to 3 states to take forward again with different legal arguments.
So we are unfortunately out of time. I just want to thank our panelists for their amazing book, which you can buy over there and over there later today. Thank you guys for really great questions.
And we just want to thank you guys for coming to this panel. It's such an important topic, and when we were writing this book, we really thought about moments like this when conversations could happen, maybe the ones we would never even hear about, but people like you would think about these issues. So if you want to talk more, we'll be at the Sip and Sign later. We'd love to connect. Thank you.